Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's a College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan Jeyarajah, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We're glad to have you with us. Today's the next installment in our series examining all the teams within the Power Four conferences. Bigger conferences mean bigger shows, so we've split each conference across 2 episodes with 2 guests and 2 furious. We've already covered the ACC and half the Big 12, so be sure to check those out if you haven't in our previous episodes. But before we dive into this, sort of a quick reminder about the conference. Obviously, the Big 12 was ahead of the curve by going divisionless. The top 2 finishers in the conference are going to be in the title game. Even if it's a rematch, we will get one true champion. More likely than not, it will assure them a top 4 seed in most years. Now, the Big 12 is, again, probably the most wide-open power conference, so we want to bring in guests who have extra insight into the teams. Today, we're going to be joined by Mitch Harper of KSLSports in Salt Lake City. He covers BYU and knows a bit about Utah and some of these teams, new and old, out west. So before we dive in, let me remind you, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Take a moment, if you can, to like, rate, and subscribe so people find us and we can find you. But without further ado, part 2 of our Big 12 series, and we're joined by Mitch Harper. He's BYU insider for KSL Sports and KSLSports.com. He's host of the Cougar Tracks podcast and Cougar Sports Saturday, as well as the First and 12 Big 12 show on KSL News Radio. He's also publisher of Cougar Sports Insiders on 247 Sports. Mitch, thank you for joining us.
Appreciate you guys having me on. Looking forward to talking some Big 12 football. It's going to be fun.
Well, it's funny. I split up the conferences, right? I'm the one who's done and done that. And we have a great group of teams today. I kind of decided, because we had Jacob Richmond on, who's a Maryland guy. Like, I put the East on his side. I gave you all the West schools. And it turns out that the West is just kicking everybody's butt right now.
It is. And this is going to be a league where, there's so much competitive balance, I feel like. You could draw up 7 or 8 teams that could win this league, maybe even stretch it out as far as to 10 if you really want to get crazy. But this will be a good league. And I think what's going to be a theme, too, with a lot of these teams we'll discuss today, a lot more physical than I think you would expect from some of these programs. And, the old school thought of just Big 12 teams slinging around, I don't know if that's the right, approach to viewing the Big 12 anymore. This is going to be a very physical football league. And I think it'll be a lot of fun to really dive into these teams and kind of get a clear sense of who is going to emerge as this chase to be the bell cow brands. I think that's what makes it so fascinating, is who's going to take that perch of being the faces of this league going forward.
Before we move forward, I wanted to ask you one quick question. What were you asking Kalani Sitake in your Twitter header? Like, it looks like he's so pensive in that moment. And I looked at it, I'm like, I love this photo of him because it looks like he's deep in thought. Like, you've asked him something where you just, like, the whole world just he was like reassembling it from scratch. And that's what every writer or journalist wants to do, ask that question that, what was it? What happened there?
I'm glad you bring that up, because I thought the same. That's why I have it up there, because I thought the same, that Kalani's just so deep in thought that it was just a good photo. It was at Big 12 Media Day. The easy answer would be we were probably talking about food. Kalani loves doing that. He's always a hit at media days. He was last year, that's for sure. But we were talking about, I remember in that moment, he was kind of deep in thought about Lavelle Edwards. We were talking about, because Tom Holmoe, the AD at BYU, gave me a commentary about how he sees some parallels between Kalani and Lavelle, and Kalani just has such a deep connection from his playing days with Lavelle, and early on in his head coaching tenure, Lavelle was someone he leaned on every single day in that first year back in 2016 for guidance and becoming a first-time head coach. And he was just talking about Lavelle Edwards and what it meant for BYU to be in a power conference stage, because BYU was just dreaming of that opportunity for so many years, but they never really thought it was going to happen, because being a faith-based university, they just thought it wasn't in the cards for them that they were ever going to get that chance. And they were one of the great beneficiaries of the Texas-Oklahoma move to the SEC, because the spot they're in now, it's a perfect fit. And Kalani was just kind of deep in thought about what the moment means for BYU to be in a power conference.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think that if you're BYU, you're probably thrilled that out of all the power conferences, the one that collapsed is the one that was probably the most unfriendly to faith-based institutions. The Big 12, of course, has quite a history with Baylor and TCU being proud brands in there, and BYU, I think, has done a great job of fitting right in. Let's go ahead and jump into this. So for people who have listened to our past couple of shows, we take every one of the teams that we're talking about and we put them into one of three categories. That's CFP contenders, middle class, and bottom tier. And of course, look, CFP contenders, it's different than it used to be. It doesn't mean you have to be one of the top 4 teams in the entire country. It means you have to be contending legitimately for the conference. I will say, Mitch, I don't know if you listened to our last show, only one of our 8 teams made the list of contenders. That was Oklahoma State. In the middle class, we had TCU, Texas Tech, and UCF. And in the bottom, we had Baylor, Houston, and Cincinnati. Again, the East not bringing it right now. The state of Texas not bringing it right now. I feel pretty confident we're going to get a few more contenders on today's show.
Definitely. There's a lot more contenders in this grouping of teams than in your previous episode, that's for sure.
Definitely. So, well, let's kick this off. Let's get things rolling. First team, Utah Utes. They obviously 8-5 last season, 5-4 in the Pac-12. So now it's going to be fun to see how they do in the Big 12. It's interesting too, by the way, they were in the Las Vegas Bowl, and I realized this season, and I believe next season, Las Vegas Bowl is going to choose from some of those former Pac-12 members that kind of spread out everywhere. But before we get into, obviously Kyle Whittingham's been there and how it's incredible, 20 seasons. And the return of Cam Rising is the headline of all of this. He obviously missed all of last season after that unfortunate injury in the Rose Bowl a few years ago. Big boost to the team and really the conference in general to see that level of competition coming from the Utes potentially. They should be strong on defense once again. And there's a couple of teams, and we talked about it last week as we were previewing Baylor. They've got a non-conference game against a conference opponent because of the legacy of it. So they're going to get sort of, if you want to look at an extra oomph by taking on Baylor as a non-conference opponent. But what do you make of the Utes? Where should we place them in those tiers? Are they CFP contender? Are they middle class? Or are they bottom tier?
CFP contenders. And you know, Utah, unlike so many in this league, they've established an identity for so many years, to Kyle Whittingham, 20 years in this program. I think that's what makes them, such a attractive team in the Big 12, because what you're getting year after year with Kyle Whittingham's program. It will be tough, though, I think, to transition to a new league. I think you got to go back to Virginia Tech when they moved from the Big East to the ACC the first time or the last time a team in a new league, in a power league, won its conference. But, half this league is pretty much new with 8 of the members joining, within the past 24 months. So, Utah's in position to get into, to Arlington and play in the college football playoff this year. And I think that the Big 12 schedule makers helped out Utah quite a bit too. I think this is one of the weaker Big 12 schedules out of the 16 teams. And, maybe you could say Brett Yormark, who loves storytelling and optionality and being additive, he gave Utah the options to where they could have a hiccup and still be okay, because I think this schedule puts them in a place where you think on the low end, maybe 9 wins. And, that's different from what we've seen in past few years for Utah, where they've had at least 4 losses in the last 3 seasons, but they've played at a high level in a very competitive Pac-12. I think Utah's in a good place. I think defensively, of course, is where the strength is with some of their personnel. I think their defensive line is stacked with Junior Tafuna, Connor O'Toole. I think Logan Fano coming back from an ACL. He is going to be excellent this season. He was a former BYU signee. He's going to be, I think, a real impact off the edge coming back from that injury. Utah will be in a good place, and they'll be in the thick of this race. You just wonder if they'll do enough to just get over the hump and break through in that playoff still, because that's one thing that Whittingham hasn't done in his tenure. And I think that having this 12-team playoff, despite moving from a league that maybe they didn't want to go into the Big 12, having the 12 playoff access, I think really it injects a lot of energy and excitement about this new move.
Yeah, I think that this is clearly a college football playoff contender. They would have been a college football playoff contender really each of the past probably 4 years or so, and I don't expect that to change. The thing that I'll say about Utah as well is that out of all of the teams in the Big 12, I think that they're the one who most has a pathway to being a complete team. I don't think that there's a true complete team in the Big 12 this year, but Utah is probably as close as we're going to get. You mentioned defensively. We know what they are. We know what they bring back. Some questions in the defensive backfield, but nothing too concerning. On the offensive side of the ball, some minor questions on the offensive line, but you get Cameron Rising back. You bring in Dorian Singer among 3 other receivers coming in to really revamp that unit. They run the ball at a high level, as we've seen. Tight end, you've got Brant Keithley coming back, and you added a transfer. So this has the potential to be a team that can beat you in a multitude of ways. And when I look at other teams in the Big 12, like we talked about Oklahoma State last week as a contender, I think they have to win a certain type of way. I think they have to run the ball well. They have to control the game. They have to control the clock. And if that doesn't happen, I think games can get away from them. I think Utah has more pathways to victory than just about anybody in the Big 12.
It's interesting, the commentary about, and I agree, the schedule looks fairly favorable for Utah. I think that makes a good transition to another team in the state of Utah, BYU, someone Mitch is very familiar with. Obviously, again, we talked a little bit about it. This is going to be, and it's amazing. It feels like Coach Satake just got there, but it's his 9th season already. They're going to probably need a little bit of improvement at quarterback. They're going to probably need to make some strides on defense. Last season, like many of the newcomers to the Big 12, they didn't do great. They went 2-7 in conference, 5-7 overall. But my goodness, this non-conference, I mean, they're going to go play at SMU, which I know is a team that Shehan's hot about. But then that conference schedule, they get everybody. They host K-State, Arizona, and Oklahoma State at one of those classic 8:15 BYU specials. And then they're going to be playing at UCF. The Holy War's back. Kansas, everything in the kit and caboodle. Maybe we can throw the Bears on there too, just to sort of see how they do. And but what do you make of the team? You know them better than anybody, Mitch. What do you make of the Cougars this season?
This is going to be a team that I feel like it all hinges on that quarterback spot. There are a lot of areas where there's some reason to be optimistic that they could get some surprise breakout performers that maybe can make a case to be all Big 12 players this season. I think at wide receiver, I think that they're going to be much improved. It's one of the deeper positions in this group. But quarterback is a real question. And I think right now it's why I would put BYU in the bottom tier, because the quarterback play for BYU in the Big 12, I think, is bottom tier. Gary Bohannon comes in from USF and previously at Baylor. That shoulder is going to be something to really monitor. It was a reconstructed shoulder. And he told me that up until about November 2023, he was probably considering retiring from football. And, some positive developments with that shoulder and his road to recovery turned the corner where football was in the cards again for him. And BYU gave him that opportunity to come back and compete. And he's going to be in the thick of that race. Jake Retzlaff's also there too, who gave some flashes last year in those losses to Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. But there's real questions, and it's opened the door for a post-spring quarterback transfer who didn't compete in spring practices at BYU, McKay Hillstead from Utah State, where he might be a guy that eventually at some point this season could start. And so it's one of the weaker quarterback units that I've seen in my time covering BYU. In fact, I think I feel confident in my last 10 years covering the program, it's the weakest I've seen, because there's been Taysom Hill, there's been Zach Wilson, Jaron Hall. They've had a string of good quarterbacks. And then you just know about the history of BYU quarterbacks. It's really good. So that position is a weakness. I also think offensive line was a real issue last year. They underachieved significantly despite having a second-team All-Big 12 player in Kingsley Suamatia, who might be the left tackle starting for the Chiefs this year. That position was underwhelming, and I think they'll be better. They got a new offensive line coach, and they kind of retooled things a little bit. Caleb Etienne, a former Oklahoma State transfer, he shed some weight. He struggled mightily last year, but he's someone to watch that I think will take big steps forward. And then I think defensively, this is going to be the area of the strength. Jay Hill, second year as the defensive coordinator. They struggled at times last season, but you could see signs that this was a much improved group from what it was 2 years ago when they really bottomed out. Jay Hill is building up the personnel. That's going to be the side of the ball that I feel you're going to see more growth, and maybe it gives you a chance to go to a bowl game despite one of the tougher schedules in the Big 12.
You mentioned the defense. I think that that's absolutely the unit I'm going to be keeping an eye on. They bring in Jack Kelly, another Weber State transfer, who Jay Hill, former head coach at Weber State. And you saw some signs last year defensively that they had a chance to be pretty good long term. And so I do think that this will be potentially a top half unit in the Big 12. But I was curious to get your thoughts on this team, of course, certainly being around BYU, but because this offense is an enigma to me in so many ways. And I'll tell you what, if the question is how good is this quarterback position going to be, like I can't buy this team then, right? Like I don't think that they have a chance to be all that good. I definitely have them in the bottom tier right now. Look, most of the bottom tier, I could see a pathway out, and BYU is certainly one of those teams, but Bobak also mentioned their schedule going on the road to SMU in week 2. To me, that's a loss most likely. You get Kansas State, Arizona, Oklahoma State at Utah, Kansas. That's as bad as it gets, right? Like I don't think it gets much worse than that. And even a lot of those games that are very losable and that you expect to lose are at home, which, maybe you can pull an upset. But then the winnable games are kind of on the road. You go at Baylor, at UCF, at Arizona State. So there's just not a whole lot of guarantee for me with BYU heading into 2024. And in a league where, again, if you fall one step behind the pack, you can find yourself losing a lot of games. It's just concerning to me.
BYU has no identity right now in this new Big 12, and I think that's what's really concerning is they have nothing to lean on that you feel confidence going to show up every single week. Tyler Batty, defensive end, he was probably their top defensive player along with Jacob Robinson, but like everything with BYU last year was inconsistent. And there were times where, BYU would go to Morgantown and face West Virginia and just get outclassed. And you felt like they didn't belong in the same field. And that was a different feeling and vibe for a BYU program that, prides itself on the last 50 years or so has been one of the more consistent winning, 8 wins as a baseline type programs. And then to make that jump up, it was a lot steeper than I think people realized. And I think that there was also a case of, I feel like players and maybe the fan base at large did a lot of just looking at logos on the helmets and thought, oh, BYU could step in and compete with the West Virginias, the Iowa States, but then they faced them and they just got outclassed. And so there's a bigger gap than I think people realized, and maybe they got humbled a little bit, and that's, going to create an opportunity to where they can maybe surprise people. And BYU is always good as an underdog, but they retain this roster. I think that's going to be one of the things that does help them. They only had 9 transfers go out. So it's pretty much a core that comes together, and you got to think that there's going to be a little bit of some steps forward. But as of right now, it's hard to expect much more than, maybe 5-7 again, because that non-conference schedule too, I thought that was poor scheduling by BYU's administration to go 2 road games out of league, and none of which is a rivalry game. I mean, that's just a very strange dynamic how they scheduled. It's not a power conference type of approach, in my opinion. And so it's going to be tough sledding for Kalani Sitake, and he's got to get it back to respectability and a winning record.
I know before we started the show, I commented to you, I remember when BYU was like the bane of the Pac-12 for a couple of seasons there. And yeah, this is definitely a shakeup moment, it felt, for a lot of folks in Provo. But moving on to one of the now new teams that's going to be joining the conference. So Arizona, the Wildcats obviously had a tremendous season last year. They went to the Alamo Bowl, which again, with the way the conference realignment is, they could go back on the other side. And they lost Jed Fish to Washington. They brought in Brent Brennan, who did for anyone who knows San Jose State, he did a solid job there building them up. So we've got a real interesting question here. They were able to keep Noah Fafita and T-Mac, who I know is, again, one of those players I know Shehan's hot on. So we're going to see that interesting balance, coaching transition versus existing talent. They got a few holes on defense. They've lost some guys to the transfer portal. They do have not a bad schedule. Again, they're one of the odd teams where they play Kansas State, but it's a non-conference game. But then they don't take on too many of the tougher opponents. Again, contrasting with what we were just saying with BYU. Where do you place them in the conference this season?
On the heels of the Alamo Bowl, I would have said CFP contender, but as things have kind of shifted this offseason, I'd say middle class. And I hesitate to say that because I do feel defensively this could be one of the best defenses since, the days with Desert Swarm when they're on the Sports Illustrated cover and they're the talk of the nation back when Dick Tomey was the head coach, because I thought it was big when they got Takario Davis out of the post-spring portal, getting him back to the program. But someone's got to be in that middle class, and I'll say there'll be a little bit of a comeback where it's classic Big 12, where you have the highs of highs, and then you resort back to a 7-5, 6-6 type season. I could see that maybe. So I'll go middle class for Arizona this year.
Yeah, they are maybe the singular program that's on that line, right? Like, I think that they are right on the line of middle class to contender. Before the coaching change, they would have been surefire contender. I think that maybe they might have been, along with Utah, my number one pick in the conference potentially. They lost defensively a little more than I think that people realize. Now, bringing back Tacario Davis, that was a big deal for them. But Bill Norton heads out the door. Their other lineman, whose name I don't want to mess up, is going out the door. Sanea is his last name. They lost another cornerback. Like, they lost some pretty major contributors from this Arizona defense. And you saw them late in the year. I mean, that Oklahoma game being such a great example in the Alamo Bowl, they were able to dominate the trenches on the defensive side of the ball. I don't feel quite as confident in that heading into 2024. I do think, though, that this will be one of the best passing offenses in the Big 12 this upcoming season. Noah Fafita has a really good case as the best quarterback. I've made the case before that Tetairoa McMillan is the best player overall in the Big 12 heading into 2024. And I think I haven't put forth a ballot as yet. He might be my preseason Big 12 Offensive Player of the Year, although Ollie Gordon will have a really good case for that as well. So I think they have upside, but it's just one of those things where I don't think you can assume consistent growth from them because of all the changes that have gone on. I like their new staff with Brent Brennan coming in. I think that Dino Babers will be able to get a lot out of this offense. But when you talk about coming off of a 10-win season and whether they're going to be able to match that, it's a lot to ask for me. So I'll agree. I have them basically on the top line of my middle class.
Yeah. Moving on. Oh, by the way, before I say one thing about the long run, I'm always curious. I think it won't affect them this season is the financial situation of the university as a whole. Yeah. And that's going to be one of those long-term questions that, again, I'm going to say probably not going to come into play this season. Although Jed Fish did say some kind of weird comments when he went to Washington, like, hey, I can now pay for this staff. I'm like, ooh. But moving on to their rivals, the Sun Devils. Now, Kenny Dillingham's first season, 3-9. It seemed at times to go better than it was supposed to, and then sometimes worse. They went 2-7 in the conference. The Jalen Rashada era started and stopped, and now he's off to Georgia. I do wonder, though, when he announced he was transferring out, and he got that nice tweet from Kenny Dillingham wishing him well, I wonder if he told him on his way out, like, I'm about to sue my former head. I'm about to sue Billy Napier. And he's like, cool, bro, not me.
Did he get his blessing? We heard that he got Kirby Smart's blessing.
Maybe everyone blessed him. We're going to find out. I can't wait for that discovery portion. But but the question is, again, looking at Arizona State, I don't think how much improvement do we expect from them heading into this season? Again, we're talking about juxtaposition. They have a fairly tough conference schedule. They get Kansas, Utah, at Oklahoma State. They got to play UCF, which was the cream of the new arrivals, and one I know that we were somewhat interested in last week when we were talking about it. And then, of course, they have at K-State and the Territorial Cup. I'm also going to circle that at Texas State game because, as we saw with Baylor, that's not a team you necessarily 100% want to trust. Where do you put them in all of this? Can they climb? I mean, I hate to say this. I hate to set it up and ask a leading question, but can they climb out of the bottom tier this season?
I think they can because I feel like the defensive line and offensive lines will be a lot better this year. I thought in the spring game, I thought their defensive line was one of the strengths coming out of spring for Arizona State, despite losing BJ Green to Colorado. We'll get to them. I think that the trenches, they're going to be in a better position, I feel like, to get them out of the bottom tier. And, I feel like Sam Leavitt will be, feels like that's where it's trending for him at quarterback for Arizona State. And I feel like he'll be a pretty good prospect, to a quarterback for ASU. So I feel like there's some good sense of energy, but this feels like a critical year for Dillingham to really kind of capture and get that fan base excited because it doesn't feel, unlike Arizona. I don't feel like Arizona State, they're kind of more along the lines of Utah where they're not as thrilled to be making this move to the Big 12. And I think having on-field success could get them fired up. And, when ASU's got an on-field product that is successful, I think that fan base in that area of Phoenix, there's money to be had there from NIL and get people excited and believing in what they can become in that conference. So I feel like I'm curious to see what Marcus Arroyo, former UNLV coach, does as the OC with Sam Levitt. So I'll still say bottom tier, but I wouldn't be surprised if they find a way to get in the middle class, because I think they're going to be a little bit nastier in the trenches than people think.
I'll say I think that investment from Phoenix and from Arizona is theoretical until it happens, because we've kind of been waiting for that for a long time, for really either of these Arizona schools to potentially come. I've said for a long time, not to get on a tangent, that like Arizona should just fully commit to just being the basketball school. Arizona State should just commit to just being the football school, and like just like own it a little bit. So one of the things that's interesting about these schools is that they're run by the same board of regents. So they're kind of like forced to have the same things, which I don't actually think is good for anybody. Anyway, this is a huge tangent. But to talk about Arizona State, the football team in 2024, the thing that concerns me about this group, and we heard Kenny Dillingham, who's a coach I believe in quite a bit, we heard him talk about a lackluster NIL situation, and that we feel like we are potentially the worst in the Pac-12. And it's been reportedly fixed a little bit, but I don't know to what level. They lost 29 transfers from this first-year team from last year. And it's not just nobodies. We mentioned, of course, Jaden Rashada going. Elijah Badger is a wide receiver who ended up being one of the top overall transfers in the portal. They lost BJ Green on the defensive line, who ended up at Colorado. It's just so many guys. Jalen Conyers, another great player at tight end, who ended up at Texas Tech. Like, these are guys going to conference opponents. And when you have a team that already lacks so much, I personally hate just seeing that many departures. And I agree on your point that I expect them to be notably better in the trenches. And because of that, I think that they will be, they have a much higher floor, I think, in 2024 than they did in 2023. But that even takes me to the quarterback situation. Of course, Sam Hauser, not Sam Hauser. I did this before. This is the weirdest mental typo that I have, which is mixing up Sam Levitt, Catton Hauser, and then the basketball player Sam Hauser. I do not know why this happens to me, but Sam Levitt is the quarterback at Arizona State. Like, he's fine. He didn't show me a lot at Michigan State. I think it's a clear downgrade from Jaden Rashada potentially coming back. They also bring in Jeff Sims as a quarterback from Nebraska. I don't know if he's going to factor into that rotation, but we saw last year their quarterback situation was completely cursed, and was a huge part of why they struggled as much as they did. So I want to believe, I truly want to believe in this Arizona State team, because I think that Kenny Dillingham's a really smart coach with a good strategy, but you got to retain a little better, and I need to see something from that quarterback position to get them out of that bottom tier.
I have to say the forcing them to have the same things made me start thinking about my parenting, like in the background. I'm doing this show from the road. I'm in a hotel room. My kids are on the 2 switches I bought them, and I'm like, should I have got them both switches? I'm literally thinking to myself, it's not the era where I grew up, where there was like a Game Gear and a Game Boy or a Turbo Express if you were really the bougie parents. But oh my goodness! All right. Well, when we come back from the break, we will take a look at 4 more teams and close out the Big 12 here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
Okay, so as we kind of dive into our final 4 teams, we're going to look at some teams that have been in the Big 12 for quite a number of years, starting here with the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, obviously, they went 9 wins last season, and for those of us who are, if you've been following college football in recent years, you know, even if you don't go back to the Charlie Weiss days, you know it's been tough sledding for the Jayhawks for quite a number of years here. So Lance Leipold, tremendous success. We've talked about him for a lot. I mean, he's now been there for 4 years, but that 6 national championships in 8 years at D3 at Whitewater was something else. Andy Kotelnicki is no longer there as offensive coordinator. Penn State got him, so they grabbed Jeff Grimes, who was previously at Baylor. Jalen Daniels, we've been talking about quarterbacks returning after injury. He missed most of last season. Exciting guy to watch. They've got some holes to fill up front. And this season they're doing that fun nomadic stadium thing because they're repairing what's going on in Lawrence. So they'll be playing non-conference games at the MLS Stadium in Kansas City, Kansas, and the conference games in Arrowhead Stadium in Kansas City, Missouri. So it'll be exciting. Lots of interesting games to watch. I'm kind of interested about that benchmarking game at Illinois to see how they do about Brett Bielema. And then UNLV will be a fun one because, again, last season was such a weird one for there. And, again, that'll be in the MLS Stadium, so it'll add more pizzazz to it. But their season, regular conference season, not too bad. They're going to West Virginia. They've got, obviously, the Sunflower Showdown. How do you place them? Where are you going to put them this season? They're one of those teams I think that's got – you could go in a lot of different directions with the Jayhawks.
I've got them as playoff contenders. And, I know a lot of it, of course, is going to hinge on Jalen Daniels. I'm very curious to see what that backup quarterback situation looks like. Cole Ballard gets a scholarship. He stepped into a few games last year, and that true freshman Isaiah Marshall, it sounded like there was a little bit of buzz about him in spring ball. But, if Daniels is healthy, last year he was the preseason offensive Big 12 Player of the Year pick, and he is dynamic as they come. And I love the backfield, too, the running backs with Neal and his shot coming back as well. So, and one thing I know, too, with Jeff Grimes as the OC, you can question his play calling because I know he was at BYU. He gets the most out of his offensive lines. And despite Kansas losing, 3 offensive linemen from last year, I think Grimes will do a great job with that offensive line unit. He always produces great O-lines, with the exception maybe being last year at Baylor, how bad they were. But I expect big things from Kansas this year. Kobe Bryant comes back as well. I think there's questions at the defensive tackle position, that interior there. If they can stop the run, I think this is a team that can win the Big 12 and be a playoff contender. So I'm bullish on the Jayhawks.
Absolutely. I will say, they are the other side of the Arizona equation to me, where they're probably my bottom contender. And it's not because of what I think they can be. It's their reliance on Jalen Daniels. And I've talked to some people around Kansas, and they kind of agree. If Jalen Daniels isn't healthy, it fundamentally changes this team. Last year, they had Jason Bean to be able to throw into the lineup, but he's gone now. Cole Ballard, a former walk-on, is potentially the backup quarterback. And like you said, they really like Zeke Marshall as potentially a freshman. If it's if Jalen Daniels misses 6 weeks or something like that, I think that we could see the freshman inserted into the lineup. But otherwise, we're going to try to make do with a quarterback who won't make mistakes and is ready for this moment. So that's my lone question with them. I think the other piece to keep an eye on is, you mentioned Jeff Grimes, of course, coming in. I got to cover him when he was at Baylor. So really, this is like the Jeff Grimes podcast in a lot of ways. He is a coach who is really adept at, like you mentioned, offensive line, at run schemes. And I think that there was some question, especially with his role at BYU, where Aaron Roderick schemed a lot of that passing game. I think there was a lot of question when he got to Baylor. What is his ability in the passing game? What does he do? What's kind of his identity? And that was such a big part of what Kansas did the past few years with Andy Kotelnicki as offensive coordinator. Will we see more of a Grimes adjusting to Leipold, or will we see more of a Leipold adjusting to Grimes? To me, it would be more valuable to see more of an adjustment towards Leipold, to see a lot of misdirection, to see a lot of, bring your quarterback on the run, for example, both as a passer and a runner. So it's a dynamic I'll be watching, but overall, this is a team that has built up depth so quickly after the crater that Lance Leipold took over. People need to remember, he took over, I believe it was in May during the COVID season, whenever he got that job. So he never even got to really meet his players. And by year 2, they're back in a bowl game for the first time since 2008. So he's done an incredible job. If Jalen Daniels is healthy, this should be his magnum opus. But back injuries are nothing to mess with. So I think we have to keep a close eye on that dynamic.
So looking at another team, also finished 9-4, but more importantly are the reigning Pop-Tarts Bowl champions and cannibals of the pastry world, the Wildcats of Kansas State. Obviously, Chris Kleiman, tremendous success at North Dakota State. It's a 6th season now in Manhattan. They've got to replace offensive coordinator Colin Klein. I still want to call him Optimus Klein. For like a hot minute when he was a quarterback there, they called him that, and that just stuck in my head. But he joined Mike Elko at the bank of Texas A&M, so they've replaced him in aggregate with Matt Wells and Connor Riley to see how that play calling goes. Obviously, a lot has been said about Avery Johnson now getting to be the lead, the starting quarterback, no longer sharing that role, and they have a dynamic backfield with Dylan Edwards from Colorado joining the already excellent DJ Giddens. They need some starters again to step up to join the O-line, and they've got a schedule that's interesting. They have, again, another intriguing P5G5 match because they're going down to New Orleans to play Tulane, and then they've got, again, as I mentioned, a non-conference game with Arizona to also add into it. But they play Oklahoma State. They've got Farmageddon at the end of the season at Iowa State, which should be exciting. Where do we put the Wildcats?
I'd put them as a playoff contender, and I think the Big 12 is at large is I think one of the big beneficiaries of a 12-team playoff. To think that Manhattan, Kansas, and we were talking about Lawrence, Kansas, to think that these programs, these towns are dreaming of playoff access. I think that's why this 12-team playoff is a great thing for the sport, because I do believe Kansas State is a 12-team playoff contender. And I feel like, as far as a program at large, right there with Utah, as far as just stability and what you expect, they didn't have much turnover with the transfer portal. The key pieces are pretty much back, and they got an upgrade at quarterback. I think Avery Johnson is going to be better than what Will Howard was. And Will Howard was second team All Big 12 last year. So I'm also intrigued by some of the additions in the post-spring window that they did add, though, from the portal, with New Mexico transfer linebacker Alec Morenko joining Austin Moore as an All Big 12 linebacker. I just think this team is really good, and they're in position to take a big jump. And they might be good enough to be, maybe an undefeated team this year in the league, which is, hard to picture with anyone, because it feels like this conference is going to produce a lot of 9-3, 8-4 type teams at the top. But I think Kansas State could be one of those special teams that could run the table.
I do think that people underestimate how much they lost from their team last year. Ben Sinnott as a tight end was a huge player for them. Cooper Beebe had a case as the best overall offensive player in the Big 12 as a left guard. But that said, they're going to be good, man. They're going to be really, really good. I think that, to go back to the conversation we had about Utah, Kansas State is a team that will be a little dependent on a particular game script, especially with the freshman quarterback in Avery Johnson out there, or I guess sophomore. I guess he did play 4 games. But, they have one of the most dynamic backfields in the country, including Avery Johnson. With Johnson, DJ Giddens was an All Big 12 player. Dylan Edwards coming in. He was really supposed to be there as part of that initial 2023 recruiting class, flipped to Colorado at the last minute, led them in rushing yards and touchdowns, and then came back to Kansas State. So I think he's going to be a huge addition for them. The thing I also like about those three is that they all provide different running styles in a lot of ways, where Dylan Edwards is a true speedster, where you have DJ Giddens, as a player who I think is very physical, can go inside, can go outside, and then Avery Johnson kind of gives you a mix of the two, along with some passing ability. So I'm very excited about what this team can be. A concern for them as well on the offensive side of the ball, they did lose Colin Klein, like we mentioned, to Texas A&M, and they hired Matt Wells, the former Texas Tech and Utah State head coach, to run that offense. But it's been a hot minute since Matt Wells has called an offense. He'll also be working with Connor Riley, their offensive line coach, as a co-offensive coordinator. Actually, Mitch, do you have any insight on Matt Wells as an offensive play caller, or was that too long ago?
Now, I remember him at Utah State, and he had some good quarterbacks. I believe he had, Chucky Keaton at Utah State. But yeah, Matt Wells, he's someone that I think, I think that was a good piece, though, adding him, because I feel like they're going to get the most out of Avery Johnson to really highlight him more than just simply that Texas Tech game where a lot of it was running. I think that he's going to become a complete passer this year, but very curious to see what Wells does with this, offense in Manhattan this year.
Yeah, and I got a chance to cover Wells quite a bit during his time at Texas Tech as well, down here in the state. And I think he fits Kansas State just a little better than he fit Texas Tech. Like, I just think personality-wise, it's a better pairing. I don't think it ever quite worked with West Texas. But, it's going to be a transition for them. It's not going to, again, just be turnkey. but they showed so much of what they could do last year and the diverse ways that they could make things happen. So I'm very excited to see what this offense. And by the way, we didn't really mention the defense. I think the defense you feel really good about. They didn't lose too much from a unit last year. That was one of the better ones in the Big 12. So again, a very high floor program, and there's a pathway to them having a down year, right? Like there's a chance that this doesn't work, that their offensive line play kind of struggles, especially with their offensive line coach having some co-coordinator responsibilities. But right now, if you ask me, I think that they probably would be behind Utah, my number 2 team in the Big 12.
So one team that I'm not sure, and when I was thinking about the Big 12, when I was doing my own prep, I'm like, this is the team I think gets discussed one of the least. It's Iowa State. Now, obviously, last season, right before the season began, they had kind of some chaos with what was going on off the field, removing players from the rotation. They still managed to go 7-6, and specifically were able to go 6-3 in the conference. Matt Campbell's been doing a great job there. It's his 9th season. Again, Iowa State's one of those jobs that historically has been extremely difficult. He's got 9 starters back on a strong defense. Rocco Beck, the quarterback from last season, is back. Their schedule is not terrible. Obviously, they got the Cy-Hawk game on 9/7. That'll be interesting. It's always interesting. You never can predict that one. There's 2 things you can't predict: the Cy-Hawk game and how Iowa State does against their FCS opponent. If it's Northern Iowa, if it's North Dakota State, this year's model is North Dakota. Who knows? You can never predict how they're going to do in that game and how it'll actually translate with the rest of the season. But all of that said, really, their toughest games come at the end of the season when they are going to be at Utah and Kansas State in back-to-back and hosting Kansas State in back-to-back weeks. What do you make of the Cyclones?
They're on that line to me of middle class, maybe college football playoff contender. I'll lean more middle class though right now. I thought last year was a nice bounce back for Matt Campbell. 2 years ago they go 4-8, and after he lost last season to Ohio, I'm thinking, is this going to be a moment where that seat gets, the heat gets ratcheted up a little bit after a disappointing, start to last year, but they turned it around, and, Rocco Beck was one of the better quarterbacks in the league last season. I feel like with the returning experience, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, years ago, last year, they had such a young football team. I think it was probably the youngest since that 2017 group that kind of laid the foundation for them to, get to a Fiesta Bowl eventually in 2020. A lot of kind of similar dynamic there with so much youth a year ago, and they've got the building pieces to kind of build something special. It's hard to always envision anything long-term in today's college football, but, they brought a lot back. More than 20 starters return for this team. I think Iowa State is going to be one of the tougher outs this year because they're kind of one of those teams that just maybe lulls you to sleep on film, but when you play them, you talk about that physicality I was noting earlier in the show. I feel like they kind of embody that. And I love the wide receivers too with Higgins and Noel. So this is a really good team that maybe at season's end could play spoiler and throw a wrench in this Big 12 race with games against Utah and Kansas State.
Well, Bobak, I want to bring up an old Split Zone Duo joke about Bedlam to describe the Iowa State rivalry, which is anything can happen, and then it used to be Oklahoma will win at the end, but it's really that Iowa will win at the end in this group. Matt Campbell, I believe he took over in 2015, and he is 1-7 against Iowa. And by the way, the one year that they did it, it's the meme. What did it cost you? It cost them everything. They went 4-8 that year, and their quarterback was arrested for gambling. So, but at the same time, if they lose that game, it really doesn't actually matter because their pathway to making the playoff is winning the Big 12, and that will essentially earn you a spot. I have our first disagreements of the day. I have them in the college football playoff category, and the reason for that, like you said, they lost some games early in the year. I believe they started 1-2, and people wrote them off after that. People kind of said, well, this isn't going to be a very good team this year. They finished 6-3. They end up having a real shot in November to go to the Big 12 championship game. And by the way, they rank number 1 nationally in returning production because of how much of their production was done by freshmen. I love, like you said, Rocco Beck. He's come along a long way since the beginning of that season. They've got some great receivers. Offensive line-wise, they bring back, I believe, every single starter that they had. And it wasn't an awesome unit last year, but I think it was okay. And I hope that they can be an above-average unit this year. I don't have any aspersions that they're going to be an elite unit. I think my biggest question for them offensively is Abu Sama, who is their superstar running back, one of the most dynamic players in college football. Can he be a solid contributor down to down? Is it going to be home runs and strikeouts, right? Is he going to be Adam Dunn, or is he going to be potentially a player who's able to be more of a complete back for them? If they struggle once again to run the ball on a down-to-down basis, that hurts them quite a bit. But I do have some faith that whether it is with Abu Sama or whether it is with their stable of running backs back there, that they're going to find a way to run the ball consistently. And then defensively, I mean, this is one of the most unheralded elite defenses over the past decade in college football under John Haycock. You expect that they're going to continue to have a chance to be really good. We've been waiting for the true, outside of COVID, let's put COVID aside, we've been waiting for the true breakout season from Iowa State under Matt Campbell. They've gotten so close over and over and over again. This is a program that's never won 10 games. This is a program that hasn't won a conference championship since 1912. I think that this is the year that they can get themselves in the conversation. I'm not saying they're going to win it. I'm not saying they're going to make it to Arlington, but I do think that they have a really good chance, even if it's because of a bowl victory, to get to 10 wins for the first time.
So I'm being asked to determine whether I think they're a middle-class team or if they are a CFP contender.
And Matt Campbell's listening. Don't mess this up.
No, I know, but it was funny to then hear how you closed your arguments there, Shehan. As someone who comes from the legal profession, hearing that, I'm like, okay. My thought is this. I agree that they're probably at the top of the middle class. I think that they can prove me wrong, and they can prove to be in a top class. But I think the problem for me is, again, I mean, while the schedule isn't terrible, as I pointed out, the very end of the season, they're going to be playing at Utah and Kansas State. Those are two teams I think have a better shot of being a CFP contender. So there has to be some give. Like eventually some team can't be. So I think by midseason, we'll have a sense that maybe one of the teams that we thought were going to be a college football contender, college football playoff contender, wasn't that. And then in which case, Iowa State, I'd be happy to climb them up. But at this point, I'm a little tentative. And I'm going to just say I'd like to wait and see. I agree. Iowa State seems to always be able to climb up. But at the same time, I remember when Seneca Wallace was a phenomenon there and they still finished like 6-6. Like that, people have to realize Iowa State's history was, I remember there was like somebody worked out the series history with them and like, I can't remember, it was like Oklahoma. And for Iowa State to even up the series, they would basically have to win every game until like the 2060s or something. So, I mean, historically, I just think I will believe it when I see it, but I think it's certainly plausible, but I'd rather revisit it. So I'm going to keep them at the middle class for now.
So the series against Oklahoma is 87-2 for the record. So like not ideal, but here's the thing.
Not ideal.
The thing. They don't have to beat Oklahoma. They don't have to beat Texas to make it happen. And I look at this next year's schedule, right? At Houston versus Baylor, at West Virginia. West Virginia might be an interesting game, but versus UCF, versus Texas Tech. At Kansas is kind of like their first big test. I think that they are very capable of handling it. Versus Cincinnati, at Utah, I'm going to say that's a loss. Versus Kansas State. So, like, they have to go, like, 2-3 in some high leverage games, and that's enough to get them to 10-2. Because I don't see, especially with their home schedule, I think they're better than Baylor. I think they're better than Houston. I think they're better than UCF. I think they're better than Texas Tech. Like, and even, for example, just to talk about it on the football field, I think that Avery Johnson at Kansas State gives them a little more upside as an offense. But I think that there's absolutely a scenario where Iowa State is not just a better offense, but potentially like a notably better offense with what some of the stuff that they bring back. You mentioned Seneca Wallace and some of those teams. Like, this isn't a one-man show, right? Like this is a top to bottom. Iowa State has the chance to be pretty special from 1 to 22 and also from 23 to 40. So I think you guys are undervaluing them. I will happily take my victory lap whenever Matt Campbell's holding up that trophy in Arlington at the end of the year, and we will make sure to revisit that.
Why stop at Arlington? Let's say Atlanta, you know. Oh, my goodness. Well, we're going to wrap this particular group of teams up with a team that everyone wants. I just have to give this anecdote. So I'm here in Toronto, right? I took my kids out. We went around town. I was taking an Uber back. And I was talking to the driver. He wanted to talk NBA, and I kind of was like, I'm not the biggest NBA guy, but I knew a few things. And
you don't
I
want
said,
to talk Scotty Barnes? Come on now.
I was like, DeMar DeRozan, he went to USC, like my alma mater, like blah, blah, blah. That's all I had. And I knew he went to the Raptors, right? But the thing is, I'm like, I do mostly college football. And he went like, what did he want to talk about? He immediately wanted to talk about Dion, my cab driver here in Toronto. So again, needless to say, more proof that the guy pulls more attention than anyone really has in this sport. And I have been very supportive of that. But he's going into his second season of a rebuilding project, which is now continuing. Pat Shurmur is going to get a full season now as offensive coordinator. Well, he's going to at least start the season. Let's just say that as the offensive coordinator. They got Robert Livingston in at defensive coordinator. Shedeur Sanders, we know the talent. The rest of the team, especially the offensive line, is going to be an interesting question there. But hey, they've got some great transfers going out and coming in now. They got Deion Haynes, who wanted to be on a team that could win when he left Pitt. So he came to Colorado, so he clearly believes in them. Now, we were talking about this with some other teams. They have a tall order with that schedule. Now, I'm a little worried. North Dakota State is in transition. They're not your older brother's North Dakota State team, but that might be a hype game if they can beat them. They've got the Nebraska rivalry again in week 2, and then the Rocky Mountain Showdown, which, by the way, I didn't realize this. It's going to be in Fort Collins, and it's like the first time in 28 years because they used to always do it in Denver. They're going to be the first time since '96. It's going to be in Fort Collins, so don't have any doubt that is going to be a hostile environment for the Buffs. And then, yeah, they get the whole shebang. They get K-State at Arizona, Utah at Kansas, and Oklahoma State at 10 a.m. on Black Friday. So, Colorado, what more needs to be said? So what do you think of Dion? No, sorry. What do you think of Colorado?
I think they're going to be middle class in this year's Big 12. I mean, I've been a huge believer in Prime, Coach Prime, and what he's going to do at Colorado. I mean, last year I thought they were still gets forgotten. I mean, that they were much better than what they were 2 years ago. They probably should have been a bowl team had they maybe made some better coaching decisions in that big lead with Stanford. They were good enough to be a bowl team a year ago, inheriting a program that was one win the previous year prior to that. I kind of felt that with the way that Colorado recruits, that they're one of the only programs, maybe outside of Texas Tech, with Joey McGuire's had a lot of success recruiting, but they're one of the only programs that can get 5-star top-end talent. And I think that alone, to me, always will give Colorado, depending on how long Coach Prime stays in Boulder, they're going to be, kind of fascinating test in this league where there's really no 5 stars. It's primarily developmental, and there's no developmental patience in Boulder with Prime. So it's a fascinating study, but I think they're going to be good enough to be middle class. I think they get to a bowl game, and Travis Hunter's the best player in this league and the best player in college football. I think that he's going to be outstanding. And offensive line's got to be better, though. I mean, that was just a disaster a season ago, to the point where Prime said he basically wanted to get rid of all of them in November. It's just the way that he talks into a mic. It's just fascinating because it's so different than what we've seen from all these college coaches. And I can't get enough. I'm fascinated to see them back in the Big 12. And I think that's going to be fun too, to reignite some, Kansas State, Colorado matchups. And I just think this is going to be a good fit for Colorado and for the Big 12. And I think they're going to be a little bit better in the trenches too. So I got Colorado squarely in the middle class going into this season.
So I have them making a bowl. I think that's probably enough to get them to the middle class. I think for me, you mentioned, of course, that they have the ability to bring in 5-star talent, but it's one of those things, right? Like if you have $1,000 and you spend $900 of it on 3 things, is that a good use of your money when you need to fill 50 things, right? Like that's kind of what's happening here, where even last year, Shedeur Sanders, I think legitimately a top 10 quarterback in college football. Travis Hunter, like you mentioned, one of the best overall players in college football. And then what? I don't think that this is even, I think you could look to basketball. In basketball, maybe if you have 2 really good guys, that can get you to competitiveness. Not necessarily winning it all, but to competitiveness. I don't know that I feel that way about college football. Now, I do think that they have a specific pathway to being legitimately good. And that pathway is the offensive line just works, right? Like if you just say, for like hypothetical sake, that the offensive line works, then I think you feel okay about what they have at receiver. I don't love that they replace all 4 running backs, but I think that, from a blocking perspective, they should be okay. Defensive line is the piece that I think that they should actually be good at. That's the best unit to me on this team. They brought in a ton of really good players, both with experience and also some guys with some high upside. Secondary, I wish they addressed a little more. I think that maybe they believe in Shiloh Sanders a little more than I might at that position group, but I think they can be okay defensively. And so it really does come down to, are they going to be able to control games? Are they going to be able to protect Shedeur Sanders? Another piece with this, by the way, is Shedeur Sanders able to avoid trouble better than he did last season? Because for all the talk about the offensive line play, Shedeur Sanders had one of the highest pressure to sack rates in all of college football, which means when he was pressured, he was going down because he holds on to the ball so long. And the other piece of it is, if you look statistically, they upgraded last year. They switched out all of their offensive linemen from the year before for players who were, quote unquote, more talented, and their unit performed worse in every single way in 2023. Now, to me, what that indicates is this is a position group where chemistry is important, and they decided to run off their 3 returning starters and bring in a whole new group. So, all this to say, I don't know what they're doing here. I don't know what their plan is in a lot of ways. And if this doesn't work on the offensive line, let's just go back and look at their schedule in a lot of ways. And honestly, I feel like maybe we need to just have an On-Field Colorado whole podcast dedicated to them, with maybe some people around the program to answer some of these questions for me, or at least what they're saying about these questions. But look at their schedule. What games on their schedule will they be favored by more than 7 points across the entire season? I think Cincinnati has a chance to be kind of bad. It'll probably be borderline with North Dakota State. I don't know where that number is going to settle, but I think that will be a game that's about a 10-point game. We'll see what Baylor is, maybe, but you look at every other game on the schedule, I don't even know how many of these other games are going to be favored in, right? At Nebraska, they're not going to be favored in. Colorado State, they'll be favored in, but that's again, that's a weird game. That's one that I would not feel amazing about. They go to UCF versus Kansas State, at Arizona, at Texas Tech, versus Utah, at Kansas, versus Oklahoma State. I don't see them being favored in any of those games. I don't think that they can even just take care of business and get to 6 wins. They might have to pull an upset just to get to 6 wins. So it's a lot of pressure on this year. If you told me, hey, Shedeur Sanders is going to be back in 2025 and this is your setup year, I'd feel pretty good about where they're at. But this is the year. Shedeur's gone after this year, and Travis Hunter is gone after this year. So I have them in the middle class, but as you can tell, I'm not feeling great about it.
Yeah, that's a brutal schedule. And then we haven't even talked about, is there going to be an EA cover curse that's now going to hit 3 teams potentially? So
even out, how does that work?
Well, he was in the middle, so he's unfortunately will it just graze those other 2? My goodness. But that before we kind of as we slowly get ready to wrap this up, the next question we have for you, Mitch, is now that and they don't have to be the teams we've talked about this week, just in the conference, who do you think is going to be the best player heading into this season?
I think it's Travis Hunter. I think he's going to be the best player in the league. I think that he's going to be amazing. I honestly, I could see going back to Colorado. I could see them starting maybe 5-0. I'm very interested in seeing how that Nebraska game plays. I think Nebraska is going to be much improved with Matt Rule, but I don't know. Maybe I'm kind of buying into Colorado as a big story. Once again, that's actually a good on-field product this season. But I think Travis Hunter should be the best player in this conference in 2024.
On the next, who do you think would be an underrated guy to look out for?
I think RJ Harvey at UCF. This league is so good with running backs, and I think people forget, about UCF and RJ Harvey, what he did, because UCF was after that loss to Baylor where they had that big lead. They just kind of were out of sight and out of mind for really anything in the Big 12 last year. But Harvey was excellent. So I think that he's someone that kind of gets lost in the shelf because of how much depth there is at running back this season in the Big 12.
Yeah, that's a great pick. I think so. And I know last week we talked quite a bit about the strong running game they have down there. And they're going to even have some backup, some tandem work down there also for that offense in UCF. So just kind of wrap everything up here. We've now gone through the entire, again, last show was a little bit bottom heavy. So we only had one college football contender from that Oklahoma State. But this week we've also added, or this episode, we've added Utah, Kansas, and Kansas State, with Shehan really wanting to add Iowa State to that group, but we didn't quite get there. So we'll have a look in on them. I think that's a good number. I think we've got out of those, I think those four. I mean, first of all, as you pointed out, Mitch, this is such an exciting season for all of these schools because most of these guys used to not consider them. Maybe Oklahoma State, Utah sometimes, especially when they're in the Pac-12. But now we have a couple more teams out there that are plausible and some that we could absolutely see climb into this. And I think that's going to be just a delight for viewers everywhere.
And I think that, from people that maybe follow the SEC or the Big Ten, they look at the Big 12 and go, how can you still be optimistic about the future of this league when you lost Texas and Oklahoma? But you see these programs, the excitement they have to be something they've never been. And I think it's 16 programs that are all chasing that. Yeah, Colorado years ago won a national title. BYU years and years ago won a national title. But in this era, in the NIL transfer portal era, all these 16 programs are looking to become a face of a conference. And I think that's just kind of a fascinating dynamic. And then you pair up that you win this league, you're in the playoff. That makes the Big 12 a great story. If this was still the 14 playoff era, I think it's a much more grim outlook for this league. But the 12-team playoff gives so much optimism and hope for this conference and their media rights. Makes for a fun setup. And I think it's just going to be kind of the football fans special where you're going to have some Friday night games. You're going to have some entertaining contests back and forth. It's going to be some really good football, I think, in this conference this year.
Well, and I think you forgot to mention, of course, 1935 and 1938 national champion TCU Horned Frogs. Come on, put some respect on Dutch Meyer's name. I will ask, so we have 5 teams right now that are bottom tier in our rankings. Baylor, Houston, Cincinnati, BYU, ASU. Which one of those teams has the best chance in your mind to rise up into the contender category?
I'd say Baylor would be my first thought. BYU too. I think there's a chance there because 4 of their 5 of the teams that BYU is going to face, or 4 of the top 5 that they face in the Big 12 are in Provo. And I think that helps their cause too. I'm really curious with Baylor, with DeQuan Finn coming in. I feel like that in Jake Spavital as the offensive coordinator, I feel like Baylor could have a bounce back. It feels like it's do or die for Dave Aranda. And maybe having that pressure of you got to perform, that maybe gets them back to respectability. But those would be my 2 picks that maybe could get out of that cellar.
September 28th, then Big 12 title implications, Baylor versus BYU. It'll be great.
Oh, I love it. So, Mitch, it's been great having you. Can you tell our listeners where they can follow you and find your work?
KSLSports.com, and they can follow me on Twitter, X, Mitch_Harper, Instagram as well. Same handle, Mitch_Harper. And yeah, I cover BYU, but also follow the Big 12 closely. I've loved following this league. It's kind of interesting. I mean, I feel like I followed it covering BYU from afar for so many years with realignment and following these conference calls and, having Oklahoma's president Dave Boren say they're going to expand, and then BYU fans getting excited. So I've always kind of kept my ear to the Big 12 because I knew this was the league that BYU was always dreaming of. So it's been great covering this conference, and looking forward to doing it more this fall. And if people want to follow, that's where they can follow me.
Awesome. No, it's always great. And I'm so glad we got to have you join us here today. Well, I wanted to also just thank all of you who have been listening to us. I wanted to thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Again, you can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja. He's my co-host. You can find his work at CBSSports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Hayeri, part of the team that runs Reddit CFB. Thank you all for joining us.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.